Welcome back to U.S. Command Insight, where we examine strategic narratives at the level where perception, doctrine, and power intersect, and where the difference between confirmed reality and operational signaling often matters more than the immediate headlines suggest. What we are looking at tonight is not simply a battlefield report. It is, in the language of modern military competition, a contested information space shaped by competing claims about a hypothetical or reported engagement in the Strait of Hormuz. In that space, the central issue is not just what happened, but what each side is trying to make others believe happened, because belief itself has become a force multiplier in 21st century deterrence. According to emerging narratives circulating through strategic analysis channels, an encounter unfolded involving advanced stealth aircraft operating in a high-tension maritime corridor, where layered air defense systems allegedly demonstrated capabilities against fifth-generation platforms under combat-like conditions. Whether every detail of these accounts reflects verified operational reality or represents a constructed strategic message is, at this stage, less important than the implications that follow if even part of this engagement logic is accurate. Because in modern warfare, especially between technologically advanced actors, the first decisive outcome is often not destruction, but exposure. And exposure changes everything. The Strait of Hormuz has always been more than a narrow waterway. It is a pressure point in the global system, a choke point through which a significant portion of the world's energy supply flows, and therefore a space where military presence is never purely tactical. It is symbolic, economic, and psychological at the same time. Every major power that operates in or around it is not just protecting assets, but projecting credibility. Now, imagine in this already compressed and sensitive environment, a scenario in which a large formation of highly advanced stealth-enabled aircraft is deployed with the mission profile of suppressing or degrading integrated air defense systems in preparation for broader operational freedom. On paper, this is a familiar doctrinal pattern. For decades, Western air power has relied on a sequential model: establish air superiority, suppress enemy defenses, then escalate precision strike operations. This model is built on a foundational assumption that technological advantage, particularly in stealth, electronic warfare, and sensor fusion, creates a controllable battle space where escalation is managed from above. The introduction of fifth-generation platforms like the F-35 was meant to reinforce that assumption. These aircraft were designed not simply as fighters, but as networked intelligence nodes capable of penetrating contested airspace with reduced detectability, coordinating strike packages, and degrading enemy response cycles before those responses could fully organize. In that doctrinal worldview, stealth is not just a feature. It is the condition that makes the entire operational concept viable. But modern air defense systems did not remain static while that doctrine evolved. Over the last 2 decades, air defense architecture has undergone a parallel transformation, one that is less visible but strategically significant. Instead of relying on single radar emitter dependence, modern integrated systems increasingly operate as layered, distributed networks. Multiple frequency bands, passive detection methods, data fusion between radar nodes, and long-range engagement envelopes have collectively changed the geometry of detection itself. In such an environment, stealth is no longer an absolute condition. It becomes a variable, dependent on range, frequency interaction, sensor integration, and the quality of the opposing network. This is where systems like the Russian S-400 family enter the strategic equation in theoretical analysis. Designed as long-range integrated air defense platforms, they are often described in military literature as multi-layered systems capable of engaging a wide spectrum of aerial targets across different altitude, and speed regimes. Their significance is not simply in missile performance, but in network structure, early warning radar, engagement radar, and long-range intercept capability integrated into a single operational framework. In contested narratives about the Strait of Hormuz scenario, it is this integration that is claimed to have created a moment of rupture. According to those accounts, stealth aircraft believed to be operating in a suppression role encountered an air defense environment that was not only active, but structurally adaptive. Instead of a linear detection to engagement chain, the system allegedly functioned as a distributed sensing network, combining multiple inputs to construct tracking solutions without relying on a single radar signature. If such a system performs as described in ideal conditions, the tactical implication is straightforward. The window of invisibility that stealth aircraft rely on becomes narrower, more conditional, and more dependent on electronic countermeasures rather than geometric concealment alone. But even this technical discussion misses the larger strategic shift, because the real transformation is not occurring at the level of individual platforms. It is occurring at the level of confidence. For decades, Western military planning has operated with a baseline assumption that qualitative technological superiority translates into operational control of escalation. That assumption does not require invulnerability, only dominance in the decision cycle. If one side can see, decide, and act faster, it controls the rhythm of conflict. Stealth aircraft were built to accelerate that asymmetry. But in contested modern airspace, the decision cycle is no longer determined by a single actor's sensor advantage. It is distributed across networks, hardened by redundancy, and increasingly influenced by systems designed specifically to deny certainty rather than guarantee it. In the Hormuz scenario being analyzed, the key operational claim is not simply that aircraft were engaged, it is that the engagement occurred faster, more cohesively, and at greater range than expected under existing threat models. That mismatch between expectation and outcome is where strategic shock originates. Military institutions are not destabilized by losses alone. They are destabilized when losses occur outside the boundaries of their predictive models. If planners believe a system can only detect at X range and it detects at X plus delta, then the entire geometry of mission planning shifts. If planners believe electronic warfare can degrade tracking below engagement quality, but tracking persists through multi-sensor fusion, then the assumed protective layer of the mission collapses. In such conditions, even partial engagement success by air defense systems forces a recalibration of doctrine. And doctrine is harder to rebuild than hardware. The narrative circulating around this incident suggests a short engagement window in which multiple aircraft were lost or rendered mission ineffective within minutes of entering contested airspace. Whether or not such figures are accurate is secondary to the strategic message being constructed around them. That stealth penetration is no longer synonymous with assured mission success in heavily layered air defense environments. That message, once believed, spreads faster than any physical system because it changes procurement decisions, alliance confidence, and escalation thresholds simultaneously. If air defense systems can credibly threaten fifth-generation aircraft, then the value of carrier-based strike projection changes. If carrier-based strike projection becomes conditional rather than assured, then maritime strategy in contested choke points becomes fundamentally more defensive in character. And that is where the Strait of Hormuz becomes more than a battlefield simulation. It becomes a psychological boundary marker, a space where the assumed hierarchy of air dominance is being publicly questioned, not through theoretical debate, but through claimed operational interaction between systems that represent opposing ends of modern military design philosophy. One built on invisibility and networked penetration. The other built on layer detection and denial. What makes this confrontation strategically significant is not that one system exists and the other exists. It is that they are now being tested against each other in environments where neither side can afford miscalculation. And in that environment, even ambiguity becomes a weapon. Because if an adversary believes that your most advanced systems are no longer guaranteed to succeed, then you do not need to destroy their capability to deter them. You only need to introduce doubt into their planning cycle. That is the real strategic effect of contested engagements, like the one being described in the Hormuz theater. They do not just produce losses or gains, they produce uncertainty at scale. And uncertainty in military strategy is often more disruptive than defeat. In the next part of this analysis, we will move deeper into the architecture of modern integrated air defense systems, the evolving logic of stealth design limitations, and why the interaction between these two systems is forcing a reevaluation of air dominance assumptions that have defined global power projection for more than 30 years. What we are witnessing in the second layer of this analysis is not the continuation of a battlefield story, but the acceleration of a strategic reinterpretation. Because once a single reported engagement, whether fully verified, partially accurate, or entirely constructed as signaling, enters the global consciousness, its physical truth becomes less important than its political utility. And in this case, the utility is enormous. Across defense ministries, intelligence agencies, and strategic planning divisions, the same uncomfortable question begins to surface whenever an incident like the Strait of Hormuz scenario is discussed. Not did this happen exactly as described, but what if a credible version of this becomes true in the next iteration of conflict? That question alone is enough to alter procurement cycles, doctrine reviews, and alliance reassurance strategies. Because modern military competition is no longer only about capability. It is about perceived survivability of capability under contested conditions. The core assumption that underpinned Western air power dominance for decades was not that stealth aircraft are invisible. That was always a simplification. The real assumption was that detection, if it occurs, happens too late at too degraded a quality or too fragmented across systems to allow coordinated engagement before mission completion. That assumption is what allowed stealth aircraft to function as strategic enablers rather than just tactical platforms. But in the contested narrative surrounding Hormuz, that assumption is directly challenged by the idea of integrated, multi-layered air defense networks achieving earlier than expected detection and more cohesive tracking continuity than anticipated. Even if only partially true, the implications are structural because the moment stealth becomes probabilistic rather than dominant, the entire logic of preemptive air suppression begins to shift. And when that logic shifts, escalation control shifts with it. We have to understand something very clearly here. In high-end warfare, especially between peer or near-peer systems, the first casualty is not equipment, it is predictability. For decades, U.S. naval aviation doctrine has relied on a predictable escalation ladder: stealth penetration, electronic warfare suppression, standoff missile engagement, and then follow-on strike waves supported by airborne command and control. This ladder depends on each rung holding long enough for the next to activate. But in environments where air defense networks are designed to operate as distributed adaptive systems, that ladder can be compressed or disrupted entirely. The consequence is not just tactical friction. It is temporal collapse of the engagement sequence. Instead of a phased operation, you get a compressed high intensity exchange where decision windows shrink from minutes to seconds, and where survivability is determined less by platform capability alone and more by pre-deployment intelligence accuracy. And intelligence, unlike hardware, is never absolute. In the Hormuz scenario being analyzed, one of the most strategically significant claims is not simply engagement outcome, but engagement tempo. The idea that the defensive network responded faster, with greater coordination, and with less reliance on single point radar exposure than legacy models predicted. If that is even partially reflective of emerging capability trends, then we are not dealing with an isolated incident. We are dealing with a systemic shift in how airspace denial is being constructed. This is where the broader geopolitical implications begin to expand beyond the Middle East, because every major military power observing this dynamic is not asking whether one system won or lost in a specific encounter. They are asking whether the cost of air dominance is increasing faster than the cost of denying it. And if denial becomes cheaper relative to penetration, then strategic behavior changes globally. This is already visible in multiple parallel developments. In East Asia, for example, long-range anti-access and area denial systems are being prioritized not as defensive tools in the traditional sense, but as strategic equalizers. In Eastern Europe, layered air defense integration is being treated not as supplementary capability, but as core national survival infrastructure. Across the Middle East, missile defense and radar fusion networks are no longer secondary investments. They are central pillars of regime security. What ties all of these together is a shared conclusion. Air superiority is no longer assumed. It is contested by design. And once that assumption breaks, everything built on it begins to shift. Now, returning to the Hormuz scenario, we must also understand the psychological dimension embedded in these narratives. Because military history is full of moments where perception of vulnerability has outpaced actual vulnerability, and that perception alone has reshaped strategy. The most important effect of any reported penetration of advanced air defense environments is not immediate loss. It is doctrinal hesitation. Commanders begin to ask different questions. What is the probability of detection? What is the survivability window after detection? What is the cost exchange ratio between aircraft and interceptor? And most importantly, is the mission still worth the risk under uncertain parameters? Once those questions enter planning cycles, operational tempo slows. And in military strategy, slowing down is often equivalent to conceding initiative. This is why even unverified or partially contested engagements can have disproportionate strategic impact. They inject friction into decision-making systems that are designed to operate on confidence. The second major layer of this analysis concerns the evolving nature of air defense networking itself. Traditional air defense systems were hierarchical. Early warning radar detects, command node processes, fire control engages. This linear model created predictable vulnerabilities. If the radar is degraded, the system weakens. If the command node is disrupted, coordination collapses. Modern integrated systems increasingly attempt to eliminate that hierarchy. Instead, they distribute sensing and engagement across multiple nodes, some active, some passive, some mobile, all feeding into a shared data environment. In theory, this creates resilience. In practice, it creates complexity, and complexity introduces its own form of unpredictability. Because when multiple detection and tracking sources converge, the system is no longer dependent on a single point of failure, but it is also dependent on flawless data fusion. And data fusion in contested electromagnetic environments is never perfect. That tension between redundancy and coherence is one of the defining technical challenges of modern air defense. In the Hormuz narrative, the implication is that this fusion reached sufficient coherence to enable coordinated engagement against stealth aircraft at scale. If that is true, it suggests a maturation of integrated air defense networks that was not fully accounted for in earlier stealth doctrine assumptions. But there is another side to this equation that is often overlooked in simplified strategic narratives. Stealth aircraft are not static systems either. They are continuously evolving through software updates, electronic warfare upgrades, sensor refinements, and tactics adaptation. Modern fifth generation platforms are less like fixed pieces of hardware and more like evolving systems of systems, which means that any engagement between stealth and air defense is not a fixed matchup. It is a moving baseline against a moving baseline. This is why no single engagement, real or perceived, can definitively prove superiority or vulnerability in absolute terms. What it can do is shift perceived curves of advantage. And perception of shifting advantage is often enough to trigger strategic recalibration at state level. Now, stepping back from the technical layer, we arrive at the most important geopolitical consequence of the Hormuz scenario as it is being discussed in strategic circles. The return of contested regional control narratives. For decades, U.S. naval and air presence in the Persian Gulf has functioned not just as deterrence, but as stabilization architecture for global energy flows. The implicit assumption behind that presence has been freedom of operation, meaning that American forces could, if required, project power rapidly and decisively to secure maritime choke points. If that assumption is challenged, even partially, then the strategic meaning of presence changes. Presence without assured dominance becomes vulnerability exposure. And vulnerability exposure forces redistribution of strategic risk. That is why discussions around carrier positioning, air wing composition, and forward deployment posture become more sensitive after incidents like the one described. Because the question is no longer just, can we operate here, but what does operating here signal about our risk tolerance? And signaling in modern geopolitics is often indistinguishable from strategy itself. The final layer we must consider is the systemic effect on global order perception. We are currently in a transition period that analysts have described in different terms: multipolar transition, fragmented order, post-unipolar diffusion. But the underlying reality is consistent across all models. The centrality of a single uncontested military enforcer is diminishing. What replaces it is not a single rival, but multiple regional capability centers that can impose local denial conditions. The Hormuz scenario, whether interpreted as operational fact, partial incident, or strategic narrative, feeds directly into that transformation because it reinforces a key idea. Even the most advanced expeditionary air power may encounter environments where access is contested, timelines are compressed, and outcomes are uncertain. And uncertainty, when institutionalized, becomes structure. In that sense, the real significance of this entire episode is not the alleged loss or engagement outcome. It is the normalization of the idea that no domain is permanently dominated. Not air, not sea lanes, not choke points, not even the technological edge itself. We are entering an era where superiority is no longer a fixed condition. It is a temporary state achieved through continuous adaptation against adversaries who are explicitly designing systems to deny that stability. And that is the true strategic shift, not collapse, not defeat, but the end of permanence in military advantage So when analysts ask whether Hormuz represents a turning point, the most accurate answer is more uncomfortable than simple victory narratives allow. It is not a turning point because of what definitively happened. It is a turning point because of what it forces every major military power to now consider as possible. And in strategic affairs, possibility is often more influential than certainty. The global order is not waiting to be rewritten in some future moment. It is being rewritten in every reassessment, every procurement decision, every doctrine update triggered by contested events like this one. And once rewriting begins at that level, there is no single event that defines the outcome. Only accumulation, only adaptation, only response. And the next phase of that response is already underway.